Hey everybody, Arjun here, and I'm obviously at the East Penn State Penitentiary, and I gotta admit it's very fascinating. If you're ever in Philadelphia, I highly recommend coming here. It's interesting because they haven't really restored it so much as halted the decay. So it's really like falling apart, but they've restored, I guess, kind of a couple sections of it. And the idea is to try to kind of preserve the experience of what was happening because this place was really falling apart when they finally closed it. It's kind of fascinating just because this was around for so long. They had all kinds of different approaches to crime. Like initially when this was founded, they got rid of group prison and everybody was given their own cell and was basically kept in solitary. I guess kind of in exchange though, sentences were relatively shorter. I think the maximum was generally about 2 years, but obviously it was more onerous because you were in solitary. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, is that preferable? And probably unlike a lot of people in these circles, I actually don't really think prison works. I I think if anything, long prison sentences render people incapable of interacting with the outside world and just kind of make them into hardened criminals. I think also a lot of people who go in who may have, I don't know, committed a crime of passion or something and who probably wouldn't be that much of a reoffender get involved with prison gangs, etc. It just seems like a cruel and unusual punishment. So I'm generally in favor of shorter sentences, but at the same time, punishing more crimes with the death penalty, beatings, public humiliation, that kind of thing, or just financial. I don't think prison is that effective. I think the most effective part of it, it was kind of interesting, they had a voting thing in one of the rooms as to what you think the best aspect of the judicial system is. And I said, in my mind at least, the primary purpose of prisons are deterrence. Because I know for my part, that's probably what I'm most afraid of. I think retribution is largely a pointless exercise. I mean, it feels good, but the ultimate point of retribution is not so much justice, because ultimately I think God will punish people in the afterlife more than we ever could, and more fairly. It's to be a deterrent. If you know you're going to be hung or get the electric chair or have a longer sentence for committing a crime, for a lot of people, at least people with something resolving low time preference, that really dissuades them from committing crimes. So to my mind, that's kind of the main purpose of it. I mean, there's also, I guess, the issue of keeping people off the streets, but to my mind, if people are so dangerous to society, like if they kill somebody or they're like a gangbanger and you're pretty sure that they're going to recommit, it might be better to just kill them then and get it over with. I think the death penalty is less onerous than getting a life sentence in prison. I think prison is cruel and unusual, especially when you get the death penalty. You know the time and hour of your death. You can speak to a priest and you can confess and you'll probably get into purgatory. So if anything, it's kind of almost a blessing in some ways to know the time and hour of your death, from a Catholic perspective at least. But yeah, it's cruel and unusual. It also is extremely expensive, and recidivism is very high. I mean, at Kingston State, they tried their best. It's kind of fascinating. If you go there, there are huge workshops, and the federal government would pay for prisoners to get to learn a trade. Like you could learn to be a plumber, to be an electrician, you could get your college, well, in Canada it's your university degree. There's all kinds of stuff you could learn, and the idea was to try to teach them practical skills, because plumbing's a good living, electrician's a great living, upholstering, furniture, cabinet making, these things are all paid decently well. The issue, I think, is in a lot of cases people were just in jail for so long they were unable to socialize with the outside world. And I can kind of understand that, because in prison, as bad as it is, you're fed 3 meals a day, everything's organized. people often do very well, or people enjoy often, very strict organization, very strict discipline. So I know, because I've worked in schools in the past, teachers who are fair but are pretty strict are generally the favored. Teachers who keep very closely to schedules, who don't really tolerate nonsense, but once again aren't kind of bitchy about it and aren't arbitrary, tend to be the teachers that students flourish the most under. A lot of people like that aspect of military life. You know what you're doing at all hours of the day. You have a purpose. Like I said, you don't have to worry about food. You don't have to worry about life necessities. You just have to worry about doing your job. And for a lot of people, that's a very desirable existence, and I can understand that. So my point is, when people leave a prison, a lot of them miss it, and some people even commit crimes to get back in. And if that is a pervasive problem, then the system obviously doesn't work. But the issue is, even if you can't rehabilitate people particularly well, you can't have these people on the streets because they're just too dangerous. So it's really hard. I guess in my view, nonviolent criminals just shouldn't go to prison. They should, like as people have said, they should be beaten or otherwise like humiliated, or just have severe financial penalties on them for the rest of their lives. But I think sending them to prison to get like raped, and I understand minimum security isn't as bad, but to just put them in a place with a bunch of other criminals, I think it makes them worse people. So I mean, if these people are so dangerous, like I said, that they can't be allowed outside, then just execute them if the evidence is irrefutable. Otherwise, I just think it's cruel and unusual. Another big issue with a lot of modern prisons is that they aren't segregated. And it's interesting because prisons will segregate themselves. Prisoners, from everything I've ever read, would prefer it if like blacks, Latinos, and white people have their own prisons, because they form gangs along racial lines, and there's very strong animosity between them. Like, the Aryan Brotherhood initially was founded, from what I've heard, as a way to prevent white people from getting raped by blacks in gangs. And then there's a bunch of other gangs that form, and that's kind of a big issue. A lot of these gangs evolve out of the prisons, and they just kind of become a hotbed for socially destructive behavior. So like I said, maybe that makes me kind of unique, or it's kind of an unusual position I hold. I don't necessarily like the counter signal, but I do kind of take pride in the fact that I'm open-minded on some of these issues. I try not to just take the kind of knee-jerk right-wing talking point, like we need more prisons, we need more incarceration. There is an issue with root problems. I think liberals aren't wrong about that. I think they're wrong in a lot of, like, certain groups are biologically more prone to crime for a number of reasons that have been addressed at length. Particularly Vox Day does a good job of talking about it in Conservative. You know, higher testosterone levels, greater, less production of stress hormones, greater tendency towards sociopathy, things like that vary a lot between different racial and cultural groups. And so there's always going to be that. I do think, and a lot of kind of people in these circles take an extreme view of it, if the black family was more intact, I think the crime rate would be a lot lower. It's always going to be a lot higher than the white one is, but as I've said in my Father's Day video, I think the single best way to ensure success, not in all cases, but the most likely way, is to have a mother and a father who are in a stable relationship and both play a role in raising the kids. I think in a lot of cases, black males don't have a strong male role model who works for a living and isn't like a degenerate gangbanger. And back before the 1960s, when the family was more intact, you still had social problems and crime problems, but they weren't nearly as bad. Kind of the breakdown of the family and the rise of the welfare state replacing it has proven to be immensely destructive, not only for blacks, but for whites and for everybody else. So, I don't know, that's kind of my thoughts on it. Just because liberals are destructive overall doesn't mean they don't have legitimate points every now and again. And I guess that would be one of them, that root causes are a pretty major issue. Anyways, guys, that's my thoughts on the matter, and I'll talk to you later.